pleasure. I'm a journalist from Suriname. The past few months, I've really been specializing in climate stories as a fellow of the Caribbean Climate Trackers. That's an organization that really tries to tell climate stories where we mostly focus on the vulnerable communities, the communities that are caught the hardest by the consequences of climate change. And we really try to be a voice for them because oftentimes they do not get to shine a light on their experiences. And I'm also a women's rights activist since I've been 16. So I'm very, very passionate about women and gender equality as well. This amazing session, Believe in Your Journey, it's going to be, we have an amazing keynote speaker. Her name is Len Ishmael. And as previously mentioned, we know that this is a session for Gen Z, the young generation. However, sometimes we may forget that there are people before us who have cleared a path for us so we can walk and we can run. And they have also had obstacles. And as the Gen Z generation, we can learn a lot from these people. I must say, there's a very well-known saying that the youth of today is tomorrow's future. But actually, for the past few years, the youth has been the most huge population of youth that the world has ever known. So we are no longer just the future, we are also the present. So it's really important that conferences like this take place, that we have spaces where we can feel like we're being heard, where we can get to know each other and really exchange our thoughts and exchange the ways in which we are fighting for the cause that we believe in, fighting for the cause that we are most passionate about. But of course, in every journey, sometimes you do have obstacles. And it's really important to never forget why you started fighting or why you started advocating or why you started your journey in the first place. So today, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Len Ishmael to the session. She will be the keynote speaker for today. She is a leading voice when it comes to the Caribbean. Her biography is so extensive, so I'm going to try to give a short overview, but she's an author, she's a former diplomat, she's a true powerhouse, a Caribbean native, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you. So, Dr. Ishmael, can you maybe give us an overview of what the start of your journey was like? I'm not sure at what age you started your journey, but would you be able to explain to us how those beginning years were?
Thank you so very much, Stephanie, and hello, Gen Z. What a lovely name. Believe in Your Journey, and what a powerful title. It's such a pleasure to have the conversation with you wherever you are. Let me congratulate the conference conveners for pulling together a superb and timely event. In this era of one crisis after another, events such as this, in which young people are so engaged, gives us reason to hope that the future is not bleak, and indeed, that the reins of leadership are being passed on to capable and very safe hands. I think one of the first exchanges which I had was with the conference conveners was to talk a little bit about my journey getting from ages 16 to 30. So let me give a little bit of an introduction to that, but then I'll step back and reflect a little bit even before that. Let me start off by saying that while for various reasons, I had a highly developed sense of the need for social justice and the power of one's voice at a very early age, I did not set out with any particular path or purpose in mind. It is perhaps only by looking back over the course of a professional and personal life, which has spanned every continent, that it has become clear to me that there have been particular threads which have remained constant throughout that journey. But in some ways, I think that perhaps we all walk also towards our destiny, and sometimes in spite of ourselves. Let me elaborate. At 17, for example, I rejected a Canadian government scholarship to undertake my first degree, not because I was not academically minded, but because my closest and dearest friends were not also going off to university. Fortunately, a lecturer at my high school informed my mother, who forced an acceptance out of me. This was to be perhaps one of the defining moments of my life for reasons which we will come to. And at 20, armed with a first degree in economics and geography, I was offered a British scholarship to undertake a master's degree in the United Kingdom. I accepted and was en route to London via Toronto, where I had been visiting friends. My luggage was on the carousel. I had my boarding ticket in hand. When, to the shock of my friends, I asked that my luggage be offloaded. Instead, I wanted to get married to the first guy who stole my heart at university. You can imagine the consternation of my family, the British government, my own government, and of course, my parents. Fast forward, I got married, completed 2 master's degrees in the United States, in New York and Boston, and by my early 30s, as a mom with 2 sons, probably aged 3 and 5, I finished my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia in 2.5 years, commuting every day from New York City, undertaking fieldwork, writing my dissertation, and taking coursework concurrently. The point I wish to make is that journeys are not always linear. They can be very messy and they can be circular. Somehow, however, fate conspires to bring us to where perhaps we were always meant to be, but with self-belief, motivation, discipline, and let me say hard work and personal sacrifice, we somehow get there. But I think, Stephanie, the real journey of this period of my life started well before. And I don't know if you want me to step back and talk about a period a little bit earlier than that.
Yes, that was a beautiful message. I would love for you to elaborate on that.
Okay, well, I think perhaps I'll reflect a little bit on what I, now that I look back, consider to be perhaps significant events that shaped the person that I became, or the person that I am today. And I think there are several moments and perhaps events which have done that shaping and influencing. And there are perhaps 3 pivotal ones. I was born in St. Lucia, but at a very early age, I was living in Germany. I mean, very, very early and very young. My dad was in the British Army. It was there in a British Army school in a foreign land, Germany, which I loved, that I first understood that I was different. And different not because of how I looked. I mean, I was a girl with long hair, but because of the color of my skin. And as a small child, inquisitive, very inquisitive, full of, very inquisitive and innocent, I had always thought that my parents and I looked like everybody else. And my earliest understanding that I was different perhaps was cruel when I look back at it, but that's not the point of that story. Perhaps too, the reason, perhaps my sense of cruelty now as an adult is why I buried this memory for decades, speaking about it publicly today for the first time. But it has become an inalienable part of who I am. A small group of kids were playing one weekend in Germany in front of our homes, and the mother of a classmate invited us for cookies and milk. It must have been November. I remember there being snow and slush and wet. Maybe I was about 5. We happily made for the front door, but the father of the girl who was my friend, who served in the army with my dad, British and white, stood in my way and said, "Not you, Len." These 3 words, which undoubtedly have provided my own guiding light through all the years, sharpened my own sense of purpose. Don't get me wrong, I never complained to my parents or anyone else. I was being bullied at school, not by German kids, not by all kids, but 1 or 2 whose parents clearly had strong views on race, and they were British. In that environment, I was alone, and I learned a hard lesson that when one is alone and one needs to stand up, one has to fight. And so I fought. And at times I struck back preemptively within a short time. Though I was never invited to a particular home when the father was there, the bullying stopped. I spoke to my mother about this episode of my early life for the first time this year at her 94th birthday. So by an early age, I was very deeply conscious of who I was and what I represented. And in many ways, this would become my mission, to use my voice against instances of injustice and inequality. Going back to St. Lucia was also significant. At the age of 11, my mom returned to St. Lucia with her kids. She missed her home. At my high school run by Irish nuns, I was alert to incidents of racial bias. And while other girls understood from time to time that they were being treated unfairly, there was no pushback. But the questioning voice against bias and discrimination was mine, even back then. I learned too that standing up comes with a price. And so while my grades were always high, these were interspersed by regular bouts of detention, never for being rude, but for constantly questioning the status quo and pushing for equality of treatment. Doing my first degree at Mode in Jamaica, thanks to my mother forcing that acceptance out of me, was also important to cementing my growing consciousness as a young person of color in an unequal world. Jamaica allowed for an important grounding in my culture and an identity of what was then known as the Third World. This was also a period of hubris, heady days of Black Power movement, liberation struggles in South Africa and elsewhere. I read copiously Stalin and Lenin. I explored the tenets of every single different type of religious belief, Buddhism, animism, and more. I was holding an identity that provided for a powerful connection with all aspects of the experience of the Global South and the challenges of development faced by countries which are poor, which unknowingly have formed the foundations for the representation which I brought to my various roles as an advocate, even today, for the Global South. Over to you, Stephanie.
Well, firstly, let me thank you so much and give you really great applause for the fact that you're demonstrating so much courage for deciding to tell this story for the first time and to really be vulnerable and share that with the younger generation because they too can learn a lot from that. I think that sets the precedent for this conference because this is a safe space where not only the younger generation but also the older generation can share their stories and share their opinions. So thank you so much for sharing that story, Dr. Len. If we look back at your journey and the obstacles that you've had to overcome, did you ever think that you would be the woman that you've grown into be today?
That's an interesting question. You know, I think that at an early age, I think I was already very conscious of how big the world was. And as I already mentioned, that the world was not always just or equal. And after my first degree, after, of course, the episode of giving up the British scholarship to the UK, my then husband and I lived in New York. And so I will share some experiences, I think, that were perhaps pivotal in shaping not just the character, but the qualifications of this woman who was then allowed to be a voice, and be a voice which over time became one which was respected. So my husband and I lived in New York. I went on to do a degree in urban planning and to work as an urban planner, a young urban planner in New York City. My doctoral degree in development economics in University of Pennsylvania allowed me to marry not only a very practical and intimate understanding of the issues of development, but also sharpened analytical thinking on the challenges of development of the Global South. I was approached as an international consultant to work with several governments, both of the North and the South, on policies dealing with international cooperation on development aid, among others, and multilateral institutions like the World Bank, among others. Always, I gave my voice in support of providing support to communities in a manner which respected and protected their dignity. I was headhunted later on by the Rockefeller Foundation to be director of a new foundation, which they were establishing to bridge the cultural divide by engaging young leaders across the world. As the institutional director, my headquarters was in New York, but I worked all over the world, from Russia to Zimbabwe, Beijing, Okinawa in Japan, Rio, and many other places. I attended, in fact, the first Environmental Development Conference in Rio in 1992, and that further shaped the career that I was going to have. I was approached by the United Nations for the post of Director of Regional Headquarters for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and subsequently by Prime Ministers of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to be their Director General, and then Ambassador to Europe. In 2017, I also went back to Tufts University in Boston. This is interesting in that after a career in diplomacy, after leading so many institutions, I went back to school. And after a PhD, I went back to another master's in diplomacy and international relations, in a sense, honing my skills as a practicing diplomat for more than 25 years. Now, all of these experiences provided me with a platform to combine passion and technical knowledge in pursuit of the development of countries of the Global South. This also required tenacity, the ability to negotiate, the ability to develop alliances to advocate for the cause which I was championing in cases where a seat at the table was not offered. Today, as an author of geopolitics, as a speaker in international events, I have a wider platform from which to continue to speak to the issues closest to my heart. The most recent book which I wrote, edited and co-authored, entitled Aftermath of War in Ukraine, West versus the Global South, has been the subject of interest and debate and discussions all over Europe and other parts of the world. And yesterday I was a speaker at the Economic Forum held in Poland, Eastern Europe's counter to Davos, with some 5,000 attendees, a huge thing. And I spoke on the Global South in this period of crisis, the legitimacy of their voice, and why the war in Ukraine is not in their interest. I speak and I spoke yesterday, not in confrontational terms, but bluntly and honestly. Audiences may not always wish to hear the message, but given that voice always remains a mission which is important and one to champion. Stephanie, back to you.
Yes, thank you. So we know that you're a Caribbean powerhouse, you're an amazing Caribbean leader, but of course you've touched upon all of the international spaces that you've been in. And we also know that sometimes in these international spaces, it's very difficult as a Caribbean native for Caribbean natives for our voices to be heard. So I'm wondering, in your career, how did you make sure that in these huge spaces, with so many other nations, that the Caribbean perspective was heard?
I think, Stephanie, in a sense, perhaps I overcompensated in my first little piece with you by speaking to that experience, you know. A lot had to do with the educational background, which I was privileged to be able to engage in, but also the privilege of lots of experiences in different parts of the world, which allowed me to broaden my own worldview with respect of other cultures, developing a sense of empathy as well for other views, which were not necessarily my own, but also understanding the need to engage factually and respectfully in discourse with persons who shared maybe sharply divergent views, but doing so from strength. And towards the end, I would speak a little bit to some of the skills that I thought were very, very important to bear in mind. I know that one of the questions that you also did suggest that I might take a look at was whether or not in all of this championing, in all of this advocacy, whether or not there was ever a sense of feeling threatened by taking a particular stance. And I've always thought, you know, that when we are young, sometimes we embark in particular courses of action without necessarily thinking of consequences. But the truth is, when you use your voice in a way that questions the status quo, you face threats. Some are more serious than others. You will be harassed, sometimes more seriously than at other times. There will be efforts to cause you reputational damage. And all of these are things that come with the territory. And if you want, I can maybe elaborate and give you two very short examples of where I thought that perhaps the issue of threats come to play in undertaking roles which might be advocacy, or sometimes standing up within an organization and using your voice to speak to power when things might be handled in a different way. Would you like me to continue?
Yeah? Yes, I would love for you to elaborate on these examples.
Okay, two quick examples. Persons who know me in the Caribbean are aware of at least one of these. In the 1990s, I was involved in a bid to stop the development of one of St. Lucia's famed pitons. It was a foreign developer who was looking to take off the top of the biggest piton in St. Lucia to allow visitors to get married in a chapel at the top for Bob Hope to come and sing on the top of that piton. And 25 acres of villas were to be developed, spilling down that go piton for the rich and famous. And that was alarming when I got news of the proposal for that development. After all, for anyone who knows the flag of St. Lucia, the twin triangles on the St. Lucian flag are the pitons. And I was already working internationally. I was not in St. Lucia at the time, but I flew back home to meet with government officials, suggesting that the project be put to a referendum of the people of St. Lucia, whether or not they wanted to use, in a sense, this place that was sacred to them to be desecrated, I thought, in this particular way. But I was only just one St. Lucian. So I asked for it to be put to referendum. And of course, the government saw it differently. I went on a path of advocacy. I was an urban planner. Of course, I understood development as well. But I wrote many pieces in the local press about the development. I went back to St. Lucia many, many times. Finally, I called a press conference joined by Derek Walcott and Llewellyn Xavier. And this comes to mind only because just a couple of days ago, a friend, a very, very old friend, meaning not that he's old, but that we go way back, sent me a photograph of me speaking at that press conference at a TV station with Derek Walcott, whom everybody would know, of course, and Llewellyn Xavier, who's a prominent and international artist of St. Lucian origins as well. The two of them joined the press conference when they heard that I was coming there, and that project was stopped. But years later, as in my very first year as the Director General of the OECS, the Twin Pitons were designated a World Heritage Site. Had that development been allowed to go through, clearly UNESCO would not have so designated the Pitons as a World Heritage Site. I could not have been more proud. But along the way, of course, there were threatening phone calls. A sibling was fired from their job. And for many years thereafter, my ability to work in the country of my birth was very, very much compromised. But threats come in other guises as well. For example, I won't talk about the threats, but just to make another point. As director with the United Nations with responsibilities for the Caribbean and the wider configuration of Latin America, for example, there was a sensibility among a few senior officials at that time, and I can say this because they no longer are around, that the Caribbean states were so small that they should be less deserving of attention, and that they were so small that they should naturally be allowed to depopulate. Naturally, I saw it in a different way. The only reason why I agreed to accept the position by the United Nations was my interest in the position to speak to the challenges of development faced by small island states in the Caribbean and to secure more resources for their development. Now, while those efforts were most appreciated by Caribbean member states, they were not, of course, met with the same amount of appreciation by headquarters. I think it is important to Generation Z or Gen Z it is really very important to make sure that your own professional goals and ethics are compatible with that of an organization of which you are a part. Otherwise, of course, there are penalties that you will pay. But perhaps I will also reflect on something which at least half of the population in the Caribbean face. Perhaps the most insidious threats come from the perception of being a woman in a man's world, and the sense in some cultures more than others of the need for a woman to know her place. It is good for a man to be ambitious, but not a woman. And this must change. And I know that change is in the making because I see it in the generations of my son. But as a girl, despite the early traumas of life in British enclave in Germany, or because of it, I came to the Caribbean feeling equal in every respect. And that sense of equality has very much been my guiding compass. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Your story, actually, I recently wrote an article for Climate Trackers about the Escazú Agreement. And I actually spoke with a young indigenous leader, and she told the story of how she was actually threatened by figures related to the government at the time because she had made a statement during the International Forum for Indigenous People in New York in 2019, I think. And she told the truth. And in her words, she told the truth and she stood up for what she believed in, and she exposed the things that were happening in our country. And when she came back, it got so severe, she was threatened, and she actually had to move to another city to keep her family safe. So that story, your story, kind of aligns with that. And the message for me that's very clear is how it's important to stay true to yourself and to stand behind fully what you believe in at everything that you say, that it's important to stand behind what you believe in and to never forget the fact or the goals in which your advocacy is being done. So thank you so much for sharing that story. We have only a few minutes left. That's very sad because I'm really enjoying this conversation with you. But I'm wondering, Dr. Ishmael, do you have any key advice for the Gen Z generation?
Yes, I think it's for the younger generation. I think it's so important to find your own niche, be as prepared as you can, read copiously, cross-reference sources of information, especially important today with all of the fake news and misinformation which we come across. Invest in your education, be authentic, develop and use your voice responsibly, be prepared for loneliness, knowing that standing up for what's right can be seen as a threat to others. Build a community of support for those times. Have empathy, and don't think you have all the answers. One never does. And just very quickly to say that I returned just last night, as I mentioned, from a conference in Poland, billed as Eastern Europe's response to Davos, with more than 5,000 people, as I said. And today, in the midst of all these crises, a global pandemic, climate, and war, in which the global South has been disproportionately affected, again, I was a speaker on a panel dealing with how best to engage with the global South, who see this war as not being in their interest. On the panel, it was very clear that mine was the voice of the global South. It is the voice that I am most associated with on the international stage. Of course, that is not intentional on my part. My career speaks to advocacy on the part of the global South. And no, it's not that it's not intentional, it's intentional on my part, of course. My whole career speaks to advocacy on the part of the global South. And the last book of which I'm both editor and co-author, of course, was titled After War in Ukraine, West versus the Global South. But the last couple of points I would like to make, I think to be persuasive, one must also understand and respect the other point of view, and therefore empathy is also important. While passion is important, views must be also backed by facts. We all start somewhere. You don't need a big stage or a huge platform to make a contribution to be heard. You can create change even within your own circle, and that is important, one ripple at a time. Those ripples add up over the years. Know your own craft, be the best that you can be. Don't expect to have others create space for you to shine. Look for mentors, but be prepared to do the heavy lifting. Be an authentic and trusted voice. that builds bridges, even with those who do not share your views, but their respect also quite often results in their desire to both listen and provide your support. And lastly, stay true to you, your values, and your journey. Work hard, make the best use of your time, but know that the most important currency which we have is that of our time. Though it may not seem so, it goes by faster than you think. Use it wisely, but be sure to engage doing things that bring you joy. And the very last piece for me, I regularly track this whole issue of joy and balance in life is important. I regularly go into the Alps for 2 weeks carrying everything, or in the Himalayas above 6,000 meters for weeks, 4 weeks on end, on my way above Everest Base Camp and back out. But that's how I stay sane. That's how I decompress. That's how I commune with nature and experience profound joy. These treks are a regular part of my life. They remind me how insignificant we are in the wider scheme of things, and why it is so important never to get bogged down by the small things. Now, this is my way. It's important that you find your own journey, and I salute all of you, and I congratulate all of you, and wish you all the very best in everything that lies ahead of you. So thank you, Stephanie.
What a beautiful message. While passion is important, it's also very important to make sure that we don't spread misinformation, and that while we are passionate, we make sure that what we are putting out there is fact-based. Thank you so much, Dr. Len Ishmael. It was a pleasure. And I think everyone who has joined into this conversation, I think they will be very thankful for the fact that you shared your journey. Of course, everybody's journeys is different, but sometimes we can learn a lot from each other. And I'm very sure that everyone who tuned in today did. So thank you so much. We're already a few minutes past time, so I'm going to say bye for now. Just make sure, of course, it's a conference. There are so many other great sessions. The next session is Climate Science BU, so make sure you join into that session as well. It was an absolute pleasure to be your moderator for today, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Stephanie. Goodbye to everyone.